Good. Okay. I have begun recording just to be sure that I don't forget. Oh, Diane. Hello.
So we are in total 58.
Yes. Isn't this exciting? Gradiola, change your name. Put your name up here, Gradiola. Oh, I should do the same thing. Sorry. How about it wait? It doesn't give. Wait, hang on. I can't find my command to change name.
Yeah, the same for me.
Yeah, I wonder why that is. Oh, well. So I'm not Gradiola, and Gradiola is not me. So, hello, everyone. I think maybe we will go ahead and begin. I want to thank everyone. As I said, this is kind of exciting. I wanted to begin with a few simple instructions. Please, everyone, mute your audio. That can be found in the little microphone icon on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. You will note, too, you have the list of all the participants. There is a question and answer box, so that if during George's presentation you would like to ask a question, please feel free to put it either there or in the chat cloud, which you also find on the bottom of your screen, but more or less to the right. What else should I tell you? That will be my job, to monitor that and be sure that I keep track of any questions that are asked. George is going to begin, and due to the number of people, he will be talking for about 40 minutes, George. And then that will give us a good 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, a little bit of interaction. So let's begin. First of all, thank you all for coming. This is, as I said, once again, exciting. And so I'd like to introduce George Simon, who really needs no introduction. Okay. George has been living in France for over 20 years. He's American from Ohio and then California originally, and working all over the world. He's a loyal member of SIETAR. He's been on the board of SIETAR Europa. He's represented SIETAR France for us. His activities in SIETAR Europa span 30 years. Today he's on the communications committee. He's working with Gradiola on the pre-Congress workshops. He is the creator of Diversity and author of many works. And today he's very proud and involved in a project in Finland, in Jyväskylä, at JAMK, which is the University of Applied Sciences, where, working with a group of students, they are creating acculturation games for migrants that are being distributed freely throughout the country. So thanks, and George, I hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Linda, and welcome everybody. I'm just overwhelmed by how many people have signed up for this, and I want to sort of begin with an acknowledgement that, despite all the nice things Linda said about me, I'm more of a journalist than I am a scholar, though I try to stay up with things and review things and see what's going on. So I have a pretty good overview of what seems to be going on in the field of intercultural studies in the context of sociology and so on, in the research area, in the universities and so on. The title of this, Stop Flogging a Dead Horse, is basically aimed at addressing the issue of it's too easy to get into a single story or a single technology or a single model in our work and expect it to do more than it can do until it expires on the street like our poor dead horse. Now, I have to say that I find doing this webinar at this moment in time extremely difficult, because there is an elephant in the room. This elephant we're all familiar with is the shift of politics in the US and its implication around the world. But more important than that is the fact that it represents a kind of cultural shift, if you will, telling us that the world as we thought it was, hoped it was, ain't exactly what it is. And whether we're talking about the Trump election in the United States or about Brexit and the rise of populism in so many countries, we're realizing that our work is more important than ever. Some of us have become a bit depressed about our work, feeling that we've accomplished so little. But I think what these things have revealed is the big challenge that lies in front of us. And so my motto this year has become, onward, let's go for it. Cambridge Dictionary picked the word of the year as post-truth. That's a very interesting word, and what it means is it's relating to or denoting the circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. Now, I want to say something. I'm not a Donald Trump fan, but I want to say something, and that is that Donald Trump has been spoken of in this word of the year term, which, as you can see from the graph here, has just climbed to everyday usage almost. I want to start out with the fact that, interpretively speaking, Donald Trump is a cultural mediator in the marketing sense, extremely effective. What does that say? He takes an idea, or if people are doing this in marketing, they take a product. He was his own product. They take an idea or a product and shape it to fit the identity discourse of the cultural target group. We hear the word cultural mediator or cultural mediation coming to the fore as a way of helping people bridge their cultures with each other. But in the world of marketing and advertising and commerce, the cultural mediator is that person with the skills of taking the idea or the product and making sure that when you hear the way it's presented, it says, oh yes, that's me, that's me, I'll take it, I'll buy it, okay? So that's an extremely important thing to pay attention to as we're going on here, because that's one of the new dimensions that we're seeing. It's the active dimension of cultural mediation, which can be used for good purposes, bad purposes, in between purposes, who knows what purposes, but it's a very, very powerful thing that we're looking at, okay? So that's where we're at with that. Now I'm going to start with something else here, which I think you'll find kind of interesting. Back in the Congress in Tallinn a couple years ago, Milton Bennett, if you're there, Milton, hi, I don't think you are, but he made a short presentation calling into question the metaphors that we have been using to explore culture. The iceberg, of course, being the most popular of these. Now, what did that mean? What did that mean? Well, what happened here was that a lot of people had a problem with it. given the reaction of a number of people in the audience about his attempt to critique the limitations of their metaphorical approaches, those were very dear to them. And in a sense, I could also have entitled this presentation, "Whose Ox is Being Gored?" Or whose ox is being shot? Because various people felt that their business was being threatened by what he was saying. So when it comes to metaphors, we have to realize that the metaphoric approach, using metaphors, is a part of our language, a part of our lives. And the important thing to realize, of course, is that the metaphors can be abundant and differ, and each might grasp a piece of the truth or a good description of what's going on, but no one of them can be the single story. Because the danger that we run into is a little bit different here. I just killed the ox, okay? Well, what you see here, of course, is that it's too easy. Studies of culture are always in flux, as is culture itself. And that means that metaphors and models are not the be-all and the end-all, but they do provide us with a temptation, perhaps unconsciously, to become one-size-fits-all in our work. And the one side, and I realize that many of you are in the business that I am of delivering intercultural training and workshops and so on and so forth. And you realize, as I do, well, some of you are younger than I am, and you don't remember when we used to have 4-day workshops, but now they want you to do that in a half of a day, or a quarter of a day, or a couple of hours. And that means it's all easy for us to take a single approach, and we leave with people having the impression that that's it, that's how it works, that's how it's done. One size fits all. And there have been a lot of discussions in the LinkedIn, for example, recently about what's called essentialist thinking, and an approach that thingifies culture, that makes it a thing rather than seeing it as a living, flowing dimension of our experience. So we need to be very careful about that. And I would like to just sort of give you an overview. What I'm going to do is talk about different approaches to culture, and largely in terms of my own experience of them, and I can't cover them all. But a good source here that you might want to think about is, this is a book by Doris Bachman-Medic, who goes through a whole mess of what she feels are the dimensions and the shifts, or as they're popularly called, the cultural turns, the turns in approaches to studying culture, the metaphors, okay? And I've got them listed on this slide. By the way, we provide everybody with a recording of this if you like, and so don't rapidly take notes or whatever, okay? But she talks about these different kinds of turns. And what you see in my presentation is an attempt to be with what I call contemporary with what's called the iconic or pictorial approach, which is lots of image that brings its own messages at the same time as we've reduced the amount of text or verbiage around it. We are in that system at the moment, and or that metaphor to a great degree. And I don't know how many people are watching this on their iPhones, but realize that iPhones, Facebook, and so on are the big land in which these kind of things are happening. And imagery, both video and still imagery, is being analyzed for its cultural perspectives and influences in a big way at this point. So that's Doris's stuff. And Doris has a good quotation that I actually want to read, and because it addresses this business of trying to make it too simple. She says, by the way, the book is extremely difficult to read, and I thought it was the fact that it was a translation from the German, and then I looked at the German book and it was even worse. I'm not criticizing the author by that, but it's a highly technical book. If you've got the stomach for it, I recommend it. It's well done. So rather than claiming culture to be an original and particular context of traditions, it should be considered as an impure mix of differing or contradictory experiences, meanings, multiple affiliations, and respective power strategies. So on the other hand, limiting oneself to a single paradigm, metaphor, or model of culture can actually turn out to be flogging a dead horse. Not only a waste of time, but a danger of becoming a dangerous kind of blindness. In the words of Nobel laureate physicist Max Born, himself a victim of Nazi persecution, he says, "The belief that there is only one truth and that oneself is in possession of it is the root of all evil in the world." Something to digest as we are fully aware of it. Now, so I too have a metaphor for culture, and it's one that I have expressed a few times. It's bubbling up like water, coming from the melting glaciers, streaming down, finding its way through all kinds of twists and turns, being augmented by the things that it washes into it, by the rains and the storms that come along. And so it becomes a kind of ongoing, changing thing, even though it seems to have a certain bed to it, a direction to it. So I like that metaphor particularly, and you know, culture is there, flowing, coming from our past, flowing with us and through us into the future. Now, I realize that we learn a lot from each other, and so I'm going to present here lots of folks that I've learned from. We're likely to be aware of the big names and the current thought leaders in the intercultural field. It's our field after all. But we often lack a bigger picture of how their approaches are related to each other, how they've both developed and deviated from each other, and how they have attempted to identify and work with the dynamics of culture. And one of the things I find a bit sad is that courses in intercultural studies rarely, if ever, teach us about these broader dimensions of our work, about the background context, if you want to get philosophical, about the epistemology of it. We lack a good history of cultural studies. Perhaps it's out there. I haven't seen it. If somebody will just give me a reference if it exists, but I'm not sure. There are bits and pieces in various books, but and we lack a philosophy and epistemology of intercultural studies. And one of the things that I'd love to see happening but hasn't happened is an exploration of the culture of interculturalists from these various perspectives. So that's a hint for those of you who are seeking areas for research or dissertation topics, or have students who are looking for them. These topics would be very worthwhile, looking at the history and the relationship, the philosophical, theoretical relationship of interculturalists and, of course, the culture of interculturalists. Now, if we had lots of time, I'd have a prize for who could identify all the people in this picture, but actually we don't have time to do that. So if you have any questions about them, you can get in touch with me later. Okay. So where do we go from here? Well, first of all, there's a major shift going on behind many of these turns that Doris has identified. And the shift is twofold. One is that we are trying to deal with the fact that abstraction is a necessary function, but abstraction is not reality. I've got a couple of quotes here, one from Alan Watts, of course, which says the menu is not the meal, and the other one from Korzybski, that the map is not the territory. These are extremely important awarenesses that give us difficulty, and we'll look at it a little bit when we talk about interpretation here, but my purpose here is to highlight how those underlying paradigms have informed our cultural research and are behind the practical models that we've either created or inherited. And that will give us a better handle on how and when to use and choose the specific tools for our research and for our practice and for our social action, for that matter. So in this short time, I can only call attention to a few of these important paradigms, but realizing that one of the threats is that abstraction, abstract dimensions and so on can be very deceptive if we're not careful with them, particularly given the limited amount of time and energy that we have. And the other part of it, the other part of what I want to say here is that we are in a world where we are shifting away from, and it's kind of scary, from the movement which has been called positivism. In other words, basically that somehow social research should be like the hard sciences and the counting of numbers and the guarantee of truth that if you've used scientific method. And I think the purpose of research here to uncover the general laws of human behavior has been a great adventure, but it cannot be done again with a single approach in a positivistic sense. We all know, for example, that we have been dealing with trying to get out of the box, okay? So that cultural dimensions are frequently interpretive, part of the interpretive turn about trying to put into terms that we understand behaviors that have been assembled in a positivistic sense to yield various kinds of cultural dimensions. What do you do with cultural dimensions? Okay, do you put people in boxes with them? If so, how do they get out? Okay, and this is a contemporary danger, okay, that's occurring not just in our field, but in populism that's surging worldwide. Okay, Brexit and Donald Trump are symptoms of where communities and cultures and nations are at. They're not the cause of what's going on per se, but they have brought it to the surface for us, which is really, really, really scary. Okay, you know, so in other words, we've had an interpretive approach to things for a long time. We remember Ed Hall on high context and low context, and then we ask ourselves, are we going in the right direction? Okay, and it's easy to label somebody else with an abstraction of high context or low context, when all that high context means is I don't understand, and you got to talk to me in my language. So a lot of the things that are happening around high context and low context need the story behind them, and we'll get down to that in a moment. But another thing I wanted to pay attention to here is what I call cultural capitalism. And here what we have is probably an advent calendar that I won't buy, okay? But one of the thing I'm calling your attention to here is there is lots of reaction to cultural appropriation. There was a whole big brouhaha about kids dressing up as other kinds of folks at Halloween. And of course, in my own culture, the U.S., this level of political sensitivity is enormous. And there's all kinds of complaints about people doing what looks like my culture, but they don't belong to my culture, and they're sort of stealing it and sometimes corrupting it. So we've got this business of cultural appropriation, which is giving us a pretty bad time. So there's this movement to use cultural items. Sometimes there's a reaction to it. Sometimes there's a Charlie Hebdo. Sometimes we just get annoyed by what we see. An extremely important turn in where we're going here in social stuff is what's called the post-colonial turn, okay? For those of you who don't speak Spanish, if that's Christopher Columbus, I don't know who that is, but he's saying, "My dear ladies and gentlemen of our ethnic minorities." An important trend in the social studies of culture has been looking at what is called colonialism, and the turn is then called post-colonialism. How well do we look at how non-Western, most of us being Western, we're not all Western out there, but how do we recognize the realities and the insights of cultures that don't fit our abstract, often positivistic models that we're dealing with? Frequently, it's hard to get at this. I look at all of the cultural publications that I review, the books that I read, and even the ones on Asian culture are basically Western approaches or scholars who have been educated in the West and are looking back on their own psychology, on their own cultural values, and so on. So we need somehow to find ways of escaping, to see other kinds of cultural expressions and cultural studies and cultural truths. And we need to be critical and look carefully at the stuff that we create and produce to say, is this really colonial or not? A lot of people are protesting today that globalization is the new colonialism, that human rights, even human rights, while we highly value the Declaration on Human Rights, to many people in the world, that's the foot in the door of Western domination, which continues. I mean, I recently reviewed a book on about the United States' history in dealing with international law and the uses of international law, which going all the way back 500 years ago as well, that international law was basically shaped as a tool for getting agreement among those who were rivals in Europe and imposing colonialism on the worlds that they were grabbing and exploring. So a lot of that happened simply because we created laws and we proposed laws, and the laws then were laws that were biased in our favor. The our being the the dominant cultures who did the kind of colonial acts. So, and of course, particularly pressing in this book was the issue of how the United States has supported the creation of all kinds of international law and then accepted itself, what's called American exceptionalism, inherited from our British ancestors. We accepted ourselves from the courts, the laws. We find ways around those kind of things. So it's extremely important to often see that sometimes the way we have expressed our best intentions and are trying to shape the world is not an honest way of doing this sort of thing, but it's an act of self-interest. So the post-colonial turn, I love this little photograph. This was at SIETAR, India. The children in the grade school were doing all these wonderful things, decorating the place where we were having our meeting. So basically, post-colonial turn means understanding the legacy of colonialism on culture and how it structures cultural studies and policies. Another turn here that we should look at is what's called a spatial turn. And that means that a lot of intercultural work and cultural study today is going into how the physical world is shaped. In other words, things tell stories too. I put a picture here of this history of the world in 1,000 Objects. There's a number of books like that in many languages. We've recently had, in the last 20 years, lots of looks at how maps have decided cultures, how they have been politically used, and so on. There's lots of resources on that now. And one of the big movements, of course, is how do we shape, for example, an urban space to be culturally sensitive? What do we put in it? How do we structure it? How do we consult the culture of the people or the cultures of the people who need to inhabit it? You know, if you don't have a word or a story for something, it doesn't exist in your world. Notice the camp chair in the lower left hand of this slide. Almost a century ago, it's one of my favorite stories, an anthropologist was studying the tribal cultures in Borneo, and a chieftain came to his camp and was interviewed with a translator, of course. And while the anthropologist, using his interpreter, was trying to get answers to many questions he had about the culture, he also noticed that the chieftain could not take his eyes off of the camp chair that was sitting off to the side. So finally he asked the chieftain, through the interpreter, what was so interesting about the chair? And the chieftain would have never seen something like that, let alone sat in it in the length of his life. So he answered the anthropologist's question with a question of his own. Why do you stack your firewood that way? Interesting. In other words, if we don't have words for things or stories for something, it doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist in the way that other people see it. And so looking at things and the stories that both create them and the stories that they create is part of this spatial turn, which is really a kind of important moment. Then it leads us to what I find is one of the most dominant elements in my own thinking at this point, and that's the linguistic and social constructivist approach, okay? Social constructionism, I think you're probably all familiar with this, tells us the reality or the social concept of something. It tells us that reality as we understand it, reality as we live in it, is jointly constructed by understandings of the world that form the basis of our shared assumptions about reality. And so identity is a matter of the stories we carry inside of us, and it's a matter of how those stories are shared, made, developed, changed, and so on. And the worlds that we know are created by us. I mean, you know, the rocks and stones are there, but such things as economic systems, you know, the economic systems are only several hundred years old. The idea of the nation state that is so much dominated, that was part of the colonial division of Africa, not according to the people reality, but according to the colonialists' needs and struggles with each other. All of these things are socially constructed, agreed upon realities. I like to call them ur-cultures, cultures that lie often beneath many of our cultures but are assumed to be real. And I find it very powerful to look at that. Let me look at one more here. What's called the reflexive turn. And I find this is really kind of interesting, because the reflexive turn is basically the way we will see it in cultural work is the rise of autoethnography. In other words, using yourself and your own experience as the basis for interpreting and identifying cultural trends. So we use self-reflection and writing to explore our personal experience. And then we connect this autobiographical story to wider cultural, political, and social meanings and the understandings that we have. I have to confess that I have about 30 years of personal journals that are full of my own reflection, which in my doting years now, I like to sit in the chair and read these things and say, oh, what did that mean? How did that come about, you know? And those of you who know that I'm a compulsive, I guess blogger is the word, posting stuff on LinkedIn and Facebook, you wonder, where's this guy come up with all this stuff? Well, I have 30 volumes of journals that I can go into there. To give a little more framework with this perspective, some of you may know these folks. They're friends of mine as well. I got acquainted with Nathalie Mont-Saint-Baudry by her book, which was called Être Française et Américaine, being a French woman and an American woman. Because Natalie was an exchange student in the U.S. Who hung on and got a job in Hollywood, and a lot of the movies that you've probably seen, U.S. movies, if you've gone to a theater in a French-speaking place, the subtitles were written by her. She spent years and years working in Hollywood. She's back in France now, and I think it's kind of interesting because her book just knocked my socks off. I lived in Los Angeles for a number of years, and reading her book made me realize a lot more of the culture that I had experienced that had not reflected on or labeled so far. Interestingly, her husband Pascal has written a book called French and Americans, The Other Coast, and it's a good book, but it is very much from the research, ethnography, interpretive point of view. So anyway, they're not divorced. They're living here in France, and they're nice people if you ever run into them. I really enjoy their stuff, okay? I'm running up on my time here, I guess, but I want to take one more item here, which I find is extremely important, and that is what we call the neuroscientific turn. Many of you know Joseph Scholz. He's presented at our congresses in various places. And what we're realizing now is that a lot of our understanding of how we are put together as human beings is being challenged by insights coming from neuroscientific studies and cognitive psychology. The quote here from Joseph is, "Culture is a process of our being, a whole body experience, engaging heart, minds, fears, aspirations, survival instincts, and desire for connection with fellow humans. This is very easily understood, I think, now in terms of, once again, the Brexit and the Trump phenomenon that we're going through. But it's also giving us some idea of how we deal with various items in intercultural work and diversity work, which you know, things like uncovering unconscious bias. Well, we're learning the dynamics of how that works, how deeply that goes into our own whole system. It's not just a matter of ideas, but penetrates into our entire system. What I've put together here is the next slide is that, yeah, shake it, baby. Watch yourself and what starts to feel and twitch at various points as you think of things and work through things and encounter people in the process. You know, what happens when you automatically move to the other side of the street when you see teenage boys, particularly if they're another color coming in your direction? These are things that diversity trainers are almost always affected with. So I've got a couple more here, but I'm going to stop at this point because we promised to give you a little space to express yourself. There's 90 of you out there, so anything you want to put into the discussion, great. And obviously we can't talk to everybody, so you know, put it into the chat or be in touch with us further. We'd like to go further.
Yeah,
I want to mention one more thing. Yeah.
Well, I have a few comments that I've picked up, and there are
Good.
more coming in now. Do you want to finish up, and then we'll open for just a few minutes of people being able to exchange and give their comments?
Okay. Well, let me do a couple more things that I want to just cite to pay attention to.
Okay.
This one is we're living in a digital turn as well. You know, here we are. It's not about hierarchy, it's about networking, and that's only coming to the fore at this point, and we need to understand what is the culture of the digital existence we're living. I was surprised, shocked, and along with Vincent Merck at the Tallinn Congress when the folks from the Netherlands came up with a networked who talks to who in SIETAR, and I was smack dab in the middle along with Vincent and with Maura Di Mauro, and at that point Candela, who was working on the Congress. So even you know, we look at if your name's up there, you see where you're at. But this is several years ago. Okay, so what does the culture of this connectivity mean? This is one of the things I'm hoping that we have some good. We're just looking at the proposals for the Dublin Congress, and I'm hoping we come up with some real good addresses for this. And the last thing I really want to look at here is well, I am a robot, okay. We have no idea what artificial intelligence is going to take us, but that's part of this technological turn that we have. And very nice way to conclude here is some of you already know that Barmeyer and Franklin have created a new book called Intercultural Management, a case-based approach to achieving complementarity and synergy. And I would like to end on the complementarity part of this, which is to say they've given a nice definition here that how are we going to complement each other using what we are learning about each other. And in order to do that, we have to have a value-free openness. We have to approach seeing other people's qualities and strengths that are applicable and can be employed as resources for whatever our adventure is. And that these characteristics get combined in various ways to best correspond to the situations we need to manage or create in the given context. So that's basically my closing point, and We want to connect our identities politically, socially, person to person, electronically, and we know that the mood in the world today is not going in that direction, so we have an enormous challenge. That's my final line, folks.
Okay, George, and first to George, we had one question that's a specific question, and that was from Jerry Weber to ask you for the title of the book that you reviewed about the use of international laws.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's, I can provide that. It's called Meeting the Enemy, and I've reviewed it for Amazon, and I think it will be reviewed in one of our SIETAR journals. The review will be repeated. I don't want to mess around with the computer and go get the exact stuff on it, but I'll
type the title into the chat box. So Jerry, there
okay, good.
is. I'm hoping from the title you'll be able to get it. And so, thank you. We had also a reference that was presented by Diane. Safir to everyone, Ala Richter's new book on international constitution and the values inherent in them. Diane, would you like to give us the name of that?
Yeah, I haven't seen that. I'd love to see that. Just put it into this chat
Put it in
there,
that
and we'll
chat box.
distribute it. Yeah.
And then what I would say is anyone else who would like to say something to George, unmute to make your comment and then mute back so that George can answer, or anyone else in the group. We have about 10 minutes to go ahead and continue on. Come on, guys. You got some ideas. Share with us.
Nothing coming up.
Well, yeah. Do you have the? Because we've got some things on the cultural shift that started with the Trump victory. Okay. From Carlos Gonzalez, and I can't see the rest on my little screen. Carlos, would you like to elaborate?
One of my favorite bloggers, Carlos.
Come on. Can you do it?
I can't hear. Can you hear?
No, I can't hear anything. Normally, hang on, let me see if I will unmute everyone, and does that make it easier for you? Carlos, are you still with us? And
let me make a comment on that. Carlos is one of my favorite people to see online, and he's got some really good, strong opinions about stuff. What I want to say is that I don't think that either Trump or Brexit is the shift. What they have done is made us aware of dimensions of situations, cultural problems, social problems, and so on that we have been ignoring for a long time. I did a post on that not too long ago on LinkedIn, but it's very much about, they revealed how big the problem is and have upset our complacency about this enormously. And this question of it's like a whole other value system out there that is a challenge to the values that we have as interculturalists. And No, enough said. Is anybody else?
I have some people that said they were trying to get in. Have you been able? Are you able to unmute now, dear participants? We also have Milton, who gave us some information about beginning books on the epistemology that you said doesn't exist. Milton's own book, Basic Concepts of Intercultural Communication, Paradigms, Principles, and Practices. And Milton, where's the other one? A Study of the Culture of Interculturalists, which was done at the Summer Institute in Portland.
Right.
Although he says that the conclusion was not particularly flattering.
Okay. Yeah, I'm looking at the chat box now, and I see a few things in here. Yes, I have reviewed Doris's book, and you can just check the title, "A Cultural Turns," on Amazon and see the review. I think it will also be published in one of our SIETAR journals. Matt Hill asks, do we have rich exceptionalism? Well, I think that may be a good way to put one aspect of what's going on, social strata and so on. Rich exceptionalism, I don't know. Depends on what you want to do with that, but we'll go with that. Let's see, Carlos. Yes, what has shifted is the collapse of Socratic, Darwinian, Newtonian, rational binary logic. Yes, that's all I can say is yes. That's what we're seeing. But I don't want to throw the baby out with the bath here. I think there are still some uses for that, obviously. But it's another framework, and we have to realize that truth comes in different kinds of frameworks. How do the turns impact on your trainings and practice? Well, a lot of my work has now been in helping people to identify the cultural discourse. So I'm very much into the linguistic, social constructionist turns in the work that I do. One of my best, that I love it, most popular workshops is sort of called "What's in a Name?" And we use people's actual names, the names they've been named, the names they've been called, their nicknames, and so on and so forth, as an exploration, not just of their roots, but of the impact of how they have been both accepted and rejected, included and excluded, as well as one of the things that happens is embracing their names. They may have been embarrassed about them and so on. So that's an important piece. I think, to me, one of my heroes is Joanna Sell, who I'll be working with in Wrocław this week for the SIETAR Poland Congress, and she's done wonderful work about storytelling. She's just recently published a cultural analysis from a storytelling perspective of the life of one of our most famous musicians, and she's gone through his letters and and his experiences and his comments about living in different countries and so on, and it's absolutely rich. And this is why I'm saying that behind every abstraction, behind every dimension, there's a story, many stories. You and I may share the same dimension, but the story of how we share it, how we act from it, how we appreciate it can be radically different.
Yes, George, did you see
yes.
Alex Frame's comment, bringing in negotiated cultural approach?
Wait a minute, let me...
For me, it's next to the last.
For some reason or other, oh, here's my mouse. Okay. Diane says,
go down to the go down to the bottom and then come back up. It's Alex Frame.
I'm looking.
And he asks about a negotiated culture approach.
I don't see any more. Wait a minute. What?
Are you in the webinar chat? I can tell it. I can read it to you. So Alex says, how about bringing a negotiated culture approach, and he quotes Brannon and Salt, into intercultural analysis applied to professional training. He says there's been a real paradigm shift in cross-cultural management field in the last 10 years. Have you got it?
No, I'm not getting it. Your voice was broken up a bit there. Try reading it once again slowly to me, please.
Yeah. How about bringing a negotiated culture approach into intercultural analysis applied to professional training?
Oh, okay.
There's been a paradigm shift in cross-cultural management field in the last 10 years, moving beyond the simplistic essentialist models. But maybe it's not easy to operationalize and use in training. What's your opinion?
Well, that's the challenge. I mean, my bottom line here was, making sure that we are not swept away necessarily by the current trends, and at the same time finding ways to use these things. As I mentioned, I found ways to use the linguistic and the interpretive and reflexive turns effectively. One of the things that we're challenged by here is how much permission we have from our participants to do what we want to do. I was trained as a Gestalt therapist. There are wonderful techniques in Gestalt therapy for looking at internal discourse and one's identity story and one's relationship to other people. But there's a rather thin borderline between how much permission do you have to tamper with people's psyches in this business. In other words, if I were taking a client, a psychological client, okay, it's that person and myself in a very specific context, and that person has asked for this. But how much can you do that will be effective and that you have permission to do? Let me put this in another context. It's been 30 years ago now, when the human potential movement was very strong. We were doing kinds of stuff in training that you wouldn't dare do today because it would be seen as too intimate or too invasive. So I see the challenge of how do we create new and useful goodies for the training room, for presentations and so on, for actively involving people. That's the question I want to leave you with. And it's not a vague question. We've got our LinkedIn, we've got our Facebook. Want to hear new ideas and what people are doing and what's worked and what's not worked. More professional exchange in that area. That's very definitely what I'm trying to do myself in my postings online, as well as hope that other people will similarly contribute their perspectives, their practices, their ideas, their images, and so on. I guess we're up on 1800.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm happy to sit here and talk some more if there are folks around. But
yeah, I wanted to say goodbye and thank you to everyone. Let you know that the new webinar calendar for next year should be coming out before the end of next week. And we're going to have this great selection and rich variety of webinars for next year, with 10 webinars being planned. As usual, the recording of this webinar will be available on the SIETAR Europa YouTube channel very soon. So thank you to everyone, and away we go. And Gradiola, can you stay on? I need to talk to you. Okay?
Yeah, for sure.
All right. Thanks. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everybody.